So, color can be kind of broken down into three distinct properties: hue, value, and saturation. So, hue is the actual name of the color or the literal color. That could be red, blue, or green. And one hue can be varied to produce many colors. So, if you think of pink, rose, scarlet, all of these colors derive from the same hue, red. And so, the second property of color is value, and that's the lightness or darkness of a color. And so the lightness or darkness of a color can be affected by changing the value. And in Illustrator, we use tints and shades, and that's a tint is when we add white, and a shade is when we kind of add black. And a normal value is when it isn't diluted with white or black. And then you have saturation. Saturation is the intensity of the color. It's sometimes called chroma. And there's definitely a relationship between value and saturation or intensity, but it is possible to change a color's intensity without changing its value. And the way you usually do that is by adding gray. Or you can mix color with its complement. Mixing colors with complements kind of neutralize them. A complement would be a color that's on the opposite side of the color scheme. And when when you put these two complements together, so you see red and green here, notice another thing that's happening, they're kind of popping. So if you put two really extreme colors that are probably opposite each other on the color wheel next to each other, then they create this intense saturation. Generally, a color that's very intense, like a pure color, a pure hue, like red, blue, or green, doesn't shift or change as much as a color that might be a third level color, for example. And they tend to stay a little bit more true, and they tend to kind of pop out more no matter what's placed next to them. Okay, so think about these qualities: value, saturation, really important, and then hue is just the original color that you're starting out with. And if you work in Illustrator and you go to that color palette, you can actually choose a hue and then just change the value and the saturation of the color you choose. Or you could create a whole color scheme by choosing one primary hue and then modifying it in slight amounts, and you would put these kind of squares next to each other as you kind of mix the color and change the color, and then you could apply them to your illustration or design. And so color schemes are when we kind of think about what colors we want to use before we start designing. Kids and sometimes student designers often just like to choose what the colors they like. Colors can be very potent, they can be interesting. And so when I ask my daughter to create a color picture, she tends to go all over the place and she just chooses here and there depending on whatever kind of mood she's in. But that's not actually the smartest way to work when you become a designer. Thinking about the color scheme and how it affects the artwork is really important. So we'll start out with monochromatic. Monochromatic color schemes use variations in lightness and saturation of a single color. So this kind of color scheme often appears kind of clean and elegant. Uh, it produces a soothing effect. It's very easy on the eyes, especially with blue or green hues. And you can kind of use it to establish an overall mood. The primary color can be integrated with neutral colors such as black, white, or gray. However, it can be difficult when using the scheme to kind of highlight the most important elements. So there's definitely pros and cons of using a monochromatic color scheme. The pro is it's easy to manage, always looks balanced and visually appealing. The cons is that the scheme can lack color contrast. It can not be as vibrant as a complementary color scheme, for example. And so sometimes people will use tints and shades and tones of the key color to enhance the scheme a little bit. But I always recommend, especially when you're working with something like a logo, to start out with a monochromatic color scheme, maybe just even one flat color mixed with black, white, or gray. because most logos, and we'll look at this a little bit later on, are actually only one color, and there's a variety of reasons you would do that. But when you're creating a design for maybe a poster or a brochure or a website, that's when you might consider, is monochromatic the way I want to approach this, or do I want to go with a different color scheme, like an analogous color scheme, which we'll talk about next. Sometimes you just use gray, black, and white too. That's considered monochromatic. In this particular image, there's a little bit of brown in the eyes, but everything else is just simple shades of gray. So analogous color schemes, uh, basically, that's when you choose colors that are adjacent to each other or right next to each other on the color wheel. And one color is usually used as a dominant color, while others are kind of used to enrich the scheme. So the analogous color scheme is similar to the monochromatic one, but it can offer a little bit more intensity. And so I would say the pros and cons of the analogous color scheme is it's easy to create, as the monochromatic, because you're just choosing kind of colors right next to each other, but it looks a little bit richer. And the cons, like the monochromatic, is that the color kind of can lack contrast a little bit. It's not as vibrant as a complementary color scheme. When you're creating an analogous color scheme, it's important to not use too many hues. That might kind of ruin the harmony. And try and avoid combining warmer and cooler colors. Warmer colors kind of being more in the red yellow zone, and cooler colors in the green blue zone. If you mix warm and cool colors, it can make a lot more maybe intensity than you want with a analogous color scheme. So then we have complementary. So complementary is a color scheme made of two colors that are pretty much opposite each other on the color wheel. So blue and orange, for example, are opposite each other. If you looked at that fine art color wheel, you would see blue and orange on opposite sides. And when using a complementary color scheme, it's important to choose a dominant color and then use the complementary color for accents. If you have one dominant color, it can create this intensity, but also be somewhat manageable for people to look at. So basically, the pros of this kind of color scheme is the complementary color scheme offers stronger contrast than any other color scheme and draws maximum attention. And so this scheme can be harder to balance than monochromatic and analogous color schemes, especially when desaturated warm colors are used. So for best results, kind of place cool colors against warm ones. For example, blue versus orange. If you can use a warm color, red or yellow, as an accent, you can desaturate the opposite cool colors to put more emphasis on the warm colors. And try to avoid using desaturated warm colors because these become kind of brown or dull yellows often. And so this is an example of an image from, I think it's a movie still. And you see the exact colors that they're choosing on the color wheel. And there's all these different types of color schemes out there. So I just kind of touched on the the three most popular ones, monochromatic, analogous, and complementary. But this is basically called double complementary, where you're taking four colors that are on the wheel, and they're opposite each other. And this color scheme is very rich, but it's also, you can notice that they're using these accent colors in small amounts. So they basically have the core colors, which might be blue, and then for the dinosaur might be green. So that's kind of the core colors. And then they're adding in very sparing amounts the red and the orange. Okay, then there's sometimes there's color schemes that are kind of all over the place, chosen from many places on the color wheel. These can be called chaotic color schemes. And when I talked about my daughter doing her pictures, she loves these chaotic color schemes with all these bright, intense colors. And they can be visually very interesting. And they can be appropriate depending on what you're designing. So for example, if you use this kind of color scheme, you're definitely going to get contrast, you're going to get intensity, you're going to get a feeling of chaos with this color scheme. And the The downside of it is it tends to dominate everything, and you kind of lose the subtlety of the illustration or the photograph or whatever else you're putting in the design. It becomes all about the color, and the mood quickly shifts into kind of an intense, chaotic feel. So just something to think about if you choose to do this. Always have a really good motivation for using a chaotic color scheme. So I'll just show you some good visuals of chaotic color schemes. And often if you use a chaotic color scheme or you're using really intense colors, it's sometimes nice to pair them with more neutral shades of black, gray, or white. It tends to soothe us as the audience as we look at the design. And then you can kind of highlight certain elements with these intense popping colors, but give us a little bit of neutral space. Okay, just a few more here. Kind of look at some. So thinking about color, and I was talking about those palettes that you want to create. You can see it up here in this painting, how very specific palettes being created first can really help us make these design decisions. We see what the colors look like next to each other. We're thinking about the color wheel and these relationships of colors to each other on the color wheel. So all something you definitely want to consider before you begin your design. And like I said, lots of different options. You have primary, you have analogous, you have complementary, then you have what's called split complementary down here, where you have three hues. So as you get into kind of color theory and thinking about color, you can start to experiment with some of the more complicated ones. And in Illustrator, you have this amazing color um, box that you can use that you can actually plug in any color you want. So you can grab like a purple, for example, and then you can ask Illustrator what the analogous colors for that purple would be, and it'll give them all to you. And then you can ask what the primary colors or what the secondary colors or the complementary colors or the split complementary colors. So it's really a cool way to work because you don't have to think about it. Illustrator will actually just generate those based on the Illustrator color wheel.